Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and good evening to our Ustream audience who's listening. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the National Archives Foundation, I welcome you to the 11th Annual McGowan Forum on Communications. As the National Archives nonprofit partner, the National Archives Foundation generates financial and creative support for the National Archives exhibitions, public programs, and educational initiatives. How many of you have been here before? Oh, love that, love that. Then you know that the theater where we're gathered this evening and the program that you're about to see exists because of the generosity of one of our most important partners, the William G. McGowan Charitable Fund. And I invite all of you who are here and who are watching online to visit our website for the foundation, archivesfoundation.org, so that you can learn a little bit more about what we do and so that you will be the first and in the know ahead of the game when we have events and exhibitions, so that you can register on time and make sure that you get a seat inside the theater. In addition to supporting the work of the National Archives, the Chicago-based McGowan Charitable Fund promotes, nurtures, and provides funding for several signature programs throughout the United States, including 3 key program areas: community initiatives for those most vulnerable, education, and healthcare and medical research. The vision of the fund is to have impact on families and communities, to create sustainable change, and to empower future generations so that they can achieve their greatest potential. We are especially grateful to have on our board the fund's executive director, Diana Spencer. And Diana is watching us tonight because the wind and the weather prevented her from flying here from Chicago. So Diana, we say hello to you. Wish you were here. We are very pleased to have with us this evening Marianne Rossica Brand, a member of the Board of Directors of the William G. McGowan Charitable Fund, whose ongoing support of not just tonight's program, but many of our programs throughout the year is very much appreciated. Please help me welcome Marianne Rossica Brand.
Thank you, Alelia. Welcome to the 11th Annual William G. McGowan Forum on Communications, Technology, and Government. With presidential election fervor percolating and potential candidates jousting for position, this is an appropriate time to discuss freedom of speech, communications, and political cartoons. How do political cartoons make a difference? We can probably agree that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that the pen is mightier than the sword. Political cartoons, by articulating a memorable visual image with scant or 0 words, powerfully advance the argument and expand the conversation. As far back as 1754, Ben Franklin published his timeless political cartoon, Join or Die. It was a woodcut of a snake cut into segments representing the divided British colonies. Franklin's metaphor became a rallying point for unity, initially in the French-Indian War and then during the American Revolution. Today's brilliant political cartoonists can take advantage of a myriad of print and web-based communications portals. But freedom of expression must never be taken for granted. We recall that 12 people, including 4 prominent cartoonists, were murdered in the Paris offices of the French satirical weekly Charlie Hebdo as retribution for published images of a religious figure. We wonder, are cartoon artists intimidated or energized by such violent responses? Tonight's program will explore the challenges and opportunities inherent in this art form, today and for the future. It is presented in partnership with the National Archives, which is supported by the William G. McGowan Charitable Fund. I've had the privilege of being a member of the fund's board since 2008. The McGowan Fund was established in 1993 to preserve the legacy of global communications legend and my uncle, William McGowan, MCI Communications founder who had died the previous year. Through its grant programs, the fund helps protect society's most vulnerable members. We support programs ranging from food banks to dental clinics, college success programs, and health promotion initiatives. Since its inception, the fund has provided over $130 million to effective grantees in the areas of healthcare and medical research, human services, and education. The William G. McGowan Theater reflects a key priority of this charismatic and charitable titan of industry. Uncle Bill loved history, movies, and debating the great ideas of the day. In 2003, the fund honored his memory by partnering with the National Archives to develop this public theater. Here, outstanding films and documentaries are screened, and important ideas are explored. This annual forum, Fall Forum on Communications, Technology, and Government, was very quickly added by the fund to augment programming at the theater. In 2008, the fund added an annual Spring Forum spotlighting women in leadership. It focuses on women in business, journalism, academia, the arts and sciences, and public service. Bill McGowan believed in a frank and open exchange of ideas, and he loved to debate and argue with his nieces and nephews, which we were tested on a regular basis. He believed in America's democratic society, backed by a democratic, independent judiciary. Only in such a democracy could Bill have led MCI, his upstart St. Louis phone service provider, to victory over corporate giant AT&T, which had a virtual lock on U.S. phone service. In 1982, capping a 10-year legal regulatory battle, a verdict in federal district court affirmed MCI's right to compete in an open marketplace, effectively ending AT&T's telecommunications monopoly. History is repeating itself. This led to healthy competition and innovation, paving the way for today's global advances in communications technology. Our distinguished panelist and moderator will take full advantage of our open forum here at the National Archives to share perspectives on the vibrant and vital process of creating political cartoons. I'm looking forward to the conversation and your questions and comments to follow. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you officially to the National Archives tonight, and a special welcome to those of you who are joining us on C-SPAN and on our National Archives YouTube channel. Since this year's topic for the McGowan Forum is political cartoons, I thought I'd mention that some of the holdings of the National Archives are in the form of cartoons. Our holdings nationwide contain thousands of examples of editorial cartoons relating to political events and personalities throughout our history. Some of the oldest political cartoons in the holdings of the National Archives are in our presidential libraries. We have a series of Dutch cartoons from 1719 in the FDR Library and a collection of Thomas Nast cartoons from the 1870s at the Eisenhower and Ford presidential libraries. But most of the political cartoons in our 13 presidential libraries deal with the actual presidents. These examples serve as proof that even and especially the leader of the free world is not immune from being skewered each morning by a newspaper editorial cartoonist. It comes with the job, and as we see daily, it goes for those who want the job also. Probably the most extensive single collection we have is the 2,400 original pen and ink drawings by cartoonist Clifford K. Berryman from the U.S. Senate collection maintained by our Center for Legislative Archives. Berryman was one of Washington's best-known and most admired graphic political commentators in the first half of the 20th century. He drew for the Washington Post from 1890 until 1907, and then the Evening Star from 1907 until his death in 1949. His cartoons touched on a variety of subjects, including politics, presidential and congressional elections, both world wars, and even Washington weather. And this is entitled The Post-Season Parade from 1915. It highlights the departure of lame duck members of Congress, those departing Capitol Hill after losing their bid for re-election, The lame ducks in this cartoon are defeated Democrats headed to the White House hoping to secure political appointments from President Woodrow Wilson. Our panel of distinguished editorial cartoonists tonight will be moderated by David Sipress. A history major at Williams College, David went on to Harvard for a master's program in Soviet history, and after 2 years dropped out to pursue a career as a cartoonist. In David's words, this may seem like a strange transition, but to me it has made perfect sense. Since I was a kid, I knew that being an artist, specifically an artist who works with humor, was what I really wanted to do with my life. After 6 months after dropping out, he published his first cartoon in the Boston Phoenix. David's first New Yorker cartoon appeared in 1998, and he was NewYorker.com's first daily cartoonist during the 2012 presidential election. His work has also appeared in Time, Parade, Playboy, The Washington Post, and Harper's. He's also lectured on the art of the cartoon, and he was the writer and host of Conversations with Cartoonists, a series of on-stage interviews with many of the artists who work on the New Yorker magazine. He's also published both fiction and nonfiction on narrative.com and on the New Yorker's website, including Marcella Hazen Changed My Life, a tribute to the great Italian chef, and My November 22nd, 1963, an account of his family's experience of the Kennedy assassination. And now I'll turn the program over to our moderator, David, who will introduce our panel.
We salute the audience.
Well done.
Good evening. I'm David Sipress. I'm moderating tonight, and I want to introduce, that's Tom Toles, Signe Wilkinson, Keith Knight, and Jen Sorensen. I asked them to put up this Thomas Nast drawing. Unfortunately, got cut off at the bottom. I put it up to give us a little context. There's a long history of this kind of cartooning in this country. I also put it up because, Tom, I want you to look at it. That's how you draw an elephant, okay? So just a few words about what I'm doing here. I am a New Yorker cartoonist. Doing political cartoons to the New Yorker is a tricky business because the sort of limitations that come down from up above are we can't advocate too directly for anything. We can't point fingers at any particular politician or policy. Basically, we just sort of go like this to the reader and say, isn't that all ridiculous? Also, part of those rules are we are not, unlike the covers, no caricatures in New Yorker cartoons and no text to explain anything. So I've developed some strategies to deal with that. One is that I use the archetypes of New Yorker cartoons and the tropes to kind of funnel my point of view. One of them, for example, is the figure of the king that I use to represent government itself or a particular politician. And I've chosen one to show you tonight. It's one I did right after the 2012 election when there was a lot of chatter about what the president had to accomplish in order to affect the way future generations would view his presidency. I also chose it because I think it's really appropriate for this venue tonight at the National Archives. I'm concerned about my legacy. Kill the historians. These guys work in a very different kind of schedule than I do. I had a little taste of it. As was mentioned, I was the daily cartoonist on the New Yorker website during the 2012 and 2014 election cycles, topical cartoon every day for 2 months. And one thing that I really came to appreciate was what it's like to deal with the enormous amount of information you have to take in order to come up with your ideas, and this cartoon was kind of a result of that. My desire to be well informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane. What these guys do is cut through all that noise and all that information, and with the tools of words and pictures together, get us to some simple, concise truths that help us all figure out what's going on. And I'm going to start out, before I show any slides, you guys are probably going to kill me, but I'm going to ask you the only a question that's going to probably, you've asked a million times and will bore you to death. It's not, where do you get your ideas? I'll get to that later. I wonder if anybody would like to say a little about how you view your role as a political cartoonist. Is your role to explain? Is it to make people laugh? Is it to change people's minds, or any combination of those? Anybody have anything to say about that? No. Okay. Well, that's one good idea gone. Okay.
No, somebody else might.
Anybody have anything?
No, that's the answer you're going to get to every question, too, by the way.
No?
I think we're going to talk about it when we get to some particular topics, because some things, every cartoon is different. You do different things in different cartoons to make different points. I mean, the day after somebody blows up Paris, a sympathy cartoon is a good idea, and yet you're not doing sympathy cartoons all week long.
Okay.
And then you move on to other things.
All right, then why don't we just dive right into the images. I'm going to show one cartoon by each of you. The first one is Tom's.
Do you want me to talk about it?
If you...
Because the answer is no.
Yeah, I mean, I have a question for you. Do you have a television where you work in your office?
I do, but I don't watch it.
So you didn't sit there all day and watch the Hillary Clinton hearing?
I absorbed enough of them through various channels to have a pretty good idea what was going on. And this cartoon, I sent this one along for the reason that, I mean, traditionally, what people look to a cartoon to do to a certain extent is to simplify a complicated situation. And I wanted, in this one, to simplify a complicated situation in a complicated way. That's all I have to say. No. The obvious idea is that the Benghazi hearings were not going according to the political agenda the Republicans had set out for them to be. In other words, a big takedown of Hillary. So the simple, shortest version of that is that it backfired on them. But that, you know, there are simpler ways to do it than I chose to do. And this was a cartoon that some people said that they had to look at it for a while because there's several things going on there. Yeah. And, you know, and sometimes complicated simple is better than simple. But I think within the complexity is it got it all in there in a kind of engaging way. And as you look at it, it's a static image, but it's potentially alive with all kinds of motion, all kinds of intent, reaction, and consequences. So it's an example of simplicity rendered complexly.
I have a couple of, I'm sorry, Jen.
I was just going to say, it's a marvel of composition.
I have a couple of questions for you generally. I made a joke about elephants before, but I am always struck in your work by how sort of cuddly all your characters are, and I wonder actually if that's a kind of strategy you use to sort of soften their...
Yeah. It's the same strategy that fishermen use. They don't just make the hook look sharp and horrible. They make it look like food. And I mean, political cartooning is often very harsh, very pointed, and I certainly enjoy and feel strongly about putting that element into my cartoons. But I don't know. I mean, you have to make choices as to how you present what you have to say. I mean, that's really half the job. And for me, I design my cartoons to reflect just my personal way of being with information and opinions. And I just feel that if you make it look sweet and non-threatening is it invites you in rather than like stiff arms you away. It invites you in, and then all of a sudden you find yourself enmeshed in my world where eventually you find out that, in fact, there is a hook in there. And
well, let me ask you this. Also, I've always been interested in your little autobiographical Tom Toles in the bottom right-hand corner. I wondered when you started doing that and what your thinking is about it.
Its initial, the thought initially obviously was derived from Pat Oliphant, who was the watershed cartoonist in American political cartooning, and he hates me to this day for adopting that. And when I would look at it, I would think that's brilliant, perfect. Can't touch it because he invented it, and it was so personal, it seemed like that was off limits, and it was for me. But I was in a library, which is sort of like an archives, one day, looking through early 20th century American political cartooning, and I found out that this kind of marginal commentary was very much part of the field, and that it wasn't an Oliphant invention. And so I thought I'll give it a try, and readers loved it right away. I mean, my variant is to actually put myself in it personally at the drawing board, and so.
Does it have the effect almost of sort of distancing yourself from the main cartoon in a way, and kind of giving a sort of off to the side second opinion?
Yeah, it's just another dimension. I mean, when I draw the cartoons as sketches just to see how they're working, I always draw them without that in mind. And if you take that away, the cartoon is designed to work without it. And a lot of times I will get to the end of the day and I won't have that part yet, and it often turns out to be the hardest part of the cartoon. But it's just it's another thing. It's another way to personalize it, to add another thought. Sometimes it reinforces the main thought. Sometimes it cuts a little bit the other way. And but again, I mean, political cartoons are very much the opinion of the cartoonist himself or herself, and I just wanted to make it clear that there's a person. It's not just a cartoon. There's somebody behind it drawing it, and that person has like their own thoughts, their own take, and it's me, and I'm not neither ashamed nor especially proud of it, but that's the way it is, and that's why I'm there.
All right. Signe, I'm going to show one of yours now, and when you sent it to me, you said, and I think this will be obvious, that it's a cartoon only a woman could do.
And this, I have to preface it by saying it was done many years ago before recent discussion of mammography has come back into discussion.
Get ready, everybody.
If Wait a minute, I was going to read it for you.
I don't think that one necessarily has to be read.
You're speechless.
I'm kind of speechless. Do you feel a certain...
Do you feel that way when you...
I wasn't... There was an article about controversy about prostate exams today, but I wasn't going to bring that up. I did want to ask you, we agree that in this particular field, there are only a few of you women cartoonists, and I wonder if you feel do you feel a particular obligation or calling to make cartoons about these kinds of issues?
No.
No, okay.
I mean, if you look at the number of cartoons I've drawn over the course of 35 years cartooning, I've drawn a lot about women, but so have men. I mean, you know, all the political issues of equal rights and the various, you know, equal pay. And actually, one of the reasons I wanted to get into cartooning was I was sick of having all the men draw cartoons. This was, you know, back when the women's movement was just getting started. I was like, maybe women could draw a few of those cartoons. It was like this men's club that you could leave the ideas at the door and they'd draw the cartoon for you. So any rate, it's been a privilege to be able to do it. When I got started at my first full-time job, which is defined by having health benefits, there were about 5 other women cartoonists in full-time jobs. And today, there's no one in actually a full-time paid position, no women, and many fewer men. So yeah, when women's issues come up, I want to draw about them, definitely. But it's not the thing I draw about most.
I consider myself a generalist, so I don't draw exclusively about gender, but at the same time, I feel it is something that I'm constantly aware of, and possibly more aware of than some people who have been in the field. Although there are many feminist, male feminist cartoonists out there. But I think that just through life experience, there are some perspectives you bring to the table. There's no one monolithic female perspective, of course, but you do add to the conversation because there's just certain things through life experience that you're just going to bring to the cartoons. So I do a fair number of cartoons about gender and women's issues, but at the same time, and I don't mind being identified as a woman cartoonist because I feel like if we're going to get more women in the media, you have to be conscious of that. You can't just sweep it under the table and say, oh well, we're just going to ignore that. But again, I do view myself as a generalist, and it's not my exclusive niche.
A lot of my hate mail begins, "Dear Mr. Wilkinson."
Oh, yeah. It is amazing. The number of people who think I'm a Scandinavian expat named Jens Sorensen. They think I'm a dude. It's amazing.
Yeah.
All right, now I'm going to show one of Keith's. Keith, do you want to read this or let people read it?
Sure. How to discern an innocent gesture from a gang sign. It's really subtle, so look closely. Peace, Vice City Vagrants. 3-point signal, Tri-City Bloods. Okie dokie, Oaktown Crips. Rock on, bro, West Side Ballers. Misguided Youth and Thug.
You originally, you come out of sort of a comic strip sort of background. Did you always do political content, or is that something that kind of developed over time?
I think it developed over time, but it was always a part of my repertoire. I think it started in college. I had my first black professor I had was in college, and he was an English American literature professor, and his name was Professor Gerald. I forget his name. Gerald. He was amazing. He gave us for a reading assignment. He gave us James Baldwin, Maya Angelou, Martin Luther King, just all bell hooks, all these different writers. And when someone brought it up to him that they were all black writers, he said they're all American writers. And my head, I was like, whoa, that was cool. He was like, here he was making statements without making statements, and just really made me rethink. My comics went from comics about keg parties to comics that meant something. Mm-hmm. And so when I got the opportunity to do it, I'd always been influenced by not just stuff like Calvin and Hobbes and Peanuts, but I was also influenced by Jules Feiffer. Mm. I always found it fun to look and find all these extra cartoons off the comics page and on the editorial page and in the classified section in Parade. And I loved the way he sometimes had panels and sometimes didn't have panels, and he would just do comics about a lot of different things. So when I started the K Chronicles, not only was it something I wanted to do or cover anything I wanted to talk about, but it also came at a time where I really wanted to do a strip that represented me, which was in the early 90s, you know, as a hip hop fan, the only time I saw people who were into hip hop, you know, they were gang members and hoodlums and all this stuff. And it was like, you know, no, actually, most people that I know that are into hip hop are smart, politically aware, and, you know, into nerdy stuff. So it was important to kind of bring that sensibility to the comics page.
One thing I've noticed in your work, and it's sort of akin to Tom's little Tom in the corner of his work, is you seem to almost have a direct conversation with the reader, like you address the reader directly in your work. Is that something you think about? And
totally conscious. Another big influence on me are my dad's side of the family. Every holiday, it would end up, we'd be down in the cellar at my great uncle's house at the bar, and everybody would be spinning these funny stories. And I always, so the K Chronicles is like this guy telling you these stories in a bar, and you're not really sure whether to believe him or not.
That's
like
great. That comes through a lot. Yeah, that's great.
So that's, you know, I always have that in mind when I'm telling the stories. Even when I tell, now I work my stories out on my 2-year-old and my 7-year-old. And it's, yeah, I can't trick them as easily as I trick everybody else.
All right, Jen, I'm going to show yours. Do you want to advance the thing each time? And
Yeah, that would help.
it's the top one.
The green button.
Yes.
Okay.
This is a piece of Jen's that's in a series of panels, so she's going to go one panel at a time.
All right. So this is Hillary Clinton, pro versus con. On the pro side, we'll keep healthcare reform, saving countless lives. On the con side, supported Iraq war, dooming countless lives. Now flying the rainbow flag. Sponsored a bill to ban burning the US flag. Vows to fight economic inequality, partly caused by her husband deregulating Wall Street. Friends with Bono. Friends with Kissinger. Would prevent total destruction of the Supreme Court. Can't do much about Scalia. Would be the first woman president. Hard sell in a country that can't even put a woman host on a major late night TV show. She's the only realistic choice. She's the only realistic choice.
So the first thing that strikes me is, you know, in the New Yorker, when I write a caption, captions are always these sort of filaments that everything has to be in exactly the right place, and there's always the kicker at the end. You always try to nail it with the last word, and you seem to have a lot of comedy chops in your work. Is that something you think about? Do you think about making it as funny as you can? Is that important to you?
That's the goal, certainly.
Yeah.
I think that the primary goal is to create something that has a point in the first place. And whether I can make that funny or not sort of depends on how the process goes. In this case, actually, one thing I found really interesting was the most controversial aspect of this cartoon by far was that she's friends with Bono. Because a lot of people didn't want to see that in the pro column. I got so much flack about Bono. I'm like, he's so much better than Kissinger. But yeah, for me, it's about, I would say it's about making a point first, but also couching it in a very digestible and hopefully amusing way.
You said, I saw an interview with you, you said something interesting about humor, that you think it's a much more effective, persuasive, and intellectually challenging way to make a point as opposed to anger, which I think
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's actually one reason I went into cartooning instead of academia.
Yeah.
I just if you can couch something in a really appealing and amusing message, people who might not be predisposed to side with you, there might be a little opening there where you can reach them. once in a while. Anyway.
Okay, and just, I didn't actually plan this, but since Signe sort of mentioned this, I wanted to show that a man can make a really interesting and powerful cartoon about women's issues. This is Tom's.
Okay, this was.
You have to read everything in this cartoon.
Yeah, no, there's a lot going on in there. This, you know, editorial. All right, I give up. Editorial cartoons are always coming, not always, but very often, since I do 6 a week, are coming right off the news. And the news this week was, they're starting to talk about putting a woman on the $10 bill, and who should it be? So the obvious thing, the first thought is, okay, well, who should it be? But that's too obvious. I mean, the thing I didn't comment on the cartoon, at least I don't think I did. Yeah, I didn't. Was, first of all, why not the 20? I mean, first of all, you got to get rid of Andrew Jackson. I think we could probably mostly agree with that. There's no justification for him being on any currency. But I think it's like, oh, well, 20s that's the currency that people actually have, because that's what comes out of the wall. Can't have that. So immediately they're talking about the $10 bill, well, you can see where I went with it, and you know, it just, well, I mean, some cartoons, once you get on the where you're going with it, they do essentially write themselves. But some of the things that I added in, well, you're way ahead of me now, but. Federal deserve note I thought was a good touch.
Excellent.
Can I compliment myself? I will.
And you're just getting started.
Yeah. Close enough for
Okay, that's
you.
enough, Tom.
Okay. All right. No, that is enough.
Another cartoon of yours is next, actually.
Okay.
So,
okay.
I asked these guys to give me each a cartoon or two on one particular subject, a difficult subject, the subject of guns. And I wanted to do it to sort of get a sense of each of them, of how these cartoon ideas happen. What's the sort of moment where you get the information and then you have that little flash of insight and the cartoon happens, and kind of an origin story of the cartoons. And I thought it would be interesting to do them all about the same topic. So I'm going to start with, sorry, Tom again, this one of yours, and why don't you tell us how this one happened?
I don't remember. All I remember is that you said, this is the one I want to put up of yours about gun control. And I actually had one that I was going to substitute for it that I liked better, but I couldn't find it.
You could have done that.
I couldn't find it. I'll describe
flexible.
It. It was somebody putting up a Second Amendment tote board, and on one side was 1,000 hash marks of, no, actually, I'm getting it backwards. The first side was number of tyrants overthrown, because this is the big argument on the Second Amendment, is that, oh, we need the firearms to overthrow tyrants. Number of tyrants overthrown, and there's no hash marks, and then number of innocent people shot with firearms, and it's just thousands. Better cartoon. But this one is interesting, at least in one way, in that it's an inversion of the expected imagery. I mean, the analogy usually tends to directly reinforce. This has the argument sort of backwards, in that the arguments against guns are coming out of the gun, and it's just a matter of number of bullets, as you can imagine them being fired, and the rate that they're being fired, and the way these weapons are often misused for horrific violence. That's about all I can say for this cartoon. Is it's just it's an inversion.
Okay, Jen, I've got your Campus Carry cartoon next, if you want to take us through that.
All right. Campus Carry. It's the hot new trend sweeping America's public colleges, allowing concealed weapons on campus. Because no college student is ever depressed, guns will only be used for protection. Enjoy enhanced theme parties. Hold still, brah. Great for late night slice defense. Step away from the pie. relish the surprise of finding your gun in your messy dorm room. Oh, there it is. Oh, who are we kidding? This will be the real campus carry. Kind of a downer. I know. Whoops. Can you make that go back?
Okay. So, again, was this, so you heard about this campus carry trend, and did this idea just pop into your head, or did it take some work and thinking?
Yeah, well, I live in Austin, Texas, and that's a start. So the University of Texas, they are going to, well, the state of Texas just passed a law this past year allowing concealed weapons on campus and basically insisting upon them to some capacity. I think they can still ban them in certain places, but basically concealed weapons for permit holders are the law of the land now. Or it will be as of, I guess, August 1st of next year. And so there are lots of protests at the University of Texas about this. The chancellor of the school, William McGowan, who was actually the guy in charge of the hunt for bin Laden. Like that's what he did before he was the chancellor of UT. He was opposed to it. All kinds of people were saying, we do not want more guns on campus. But so there's a big protest movement sort of gathering for when this actually happens next year. And so that was the thing that really inspired this cartoon.
Okay, Keith, I'm going to put two of yours up, one specifically about guns that you gave me, and then a second one of yours that is also in its own way about guns, and you can talk about either or both of them in terms of how they work for you. I'm going to show them both. The first one is this one.
Remember, folks, hug them extra tight before going to sleep tonight. You never know when they might be taken away from you.
And then this one, a very serious and moving cartoon.
Oh, yeah.
Why don't you tell me a little about this one?
It's interesting about this one because if you're not a nerd, then you probably don't get it. But basically, I did this just after the Dylann Roof shooting in South Carolina. And a week before, what gave me the idea is a week before in South Carolina, the kid who played Anakin Skywalker in The Phantom Menace was actually pulled over after a high-speed 100-mile-an-hour chase by South Carolina police. Like, the kid is so traumatized from being in that movie that he's like a mess now. And so when Dylann Roof happened, and they posted some of his pictures on Facebook or wherever, he had the same sort of bowl cut that the kid had from Phantom Menace, and I was like, oh my goodness, that's like that Anakin Skywalker
So that
kid.
connection happened for
Yeah,
you.
so the connection was like that, and I just, I just drew him with the bowl cut and had those two little flags there, 3 flags, I should say, and the gun, and sort of it just made sense with the shadow and everything.
What kind of response did you get from the cartoon?
Just, it was one of those, a lot of people just sit there and go, wow, that's
pretty
like,
powerful.
Yeah, it's like one of your best. And someone, one nerdy blogger guy put it really, really well. Like, and I got to take his quote and put it on my website. I can't remember it now, but it was like, yeah, that's what I want to hear. But yeah, it really went over well. Yeah. But now people see it and go, what's that mean? Yeah. Just sometimes, like when you do stuff of the moment, it doesn't necessarily last. But the strip before, you always hear the sort of hug them while you can. I just hear that over and over and over. After every shooting, hug your kids, hug your, this, that, before they get taken away from you.
I see.
And it just automatically, I thought of guns instead of
It's interesting
kids.
because humor really is always about juxtaposition, about putting together two things and kind of exploding into a joke. And I think you all have shown aspects of that in your work. Jen, you gave me also 2 cartoons, and for a specific reason. And did you want me to show them both right away, or just show the first one and then?
Talking to
No,
Signe?
Signe, I'm sorry.
Yeah. The other
The other woman. Yeah. You know, at the New Yorker, there was a scandalous survey taken recently where someone toted up the number of women and the number of people of color in the cartoons themselves, and it was an unbelievably tiny number. And we all, like, you know, have been rushing to draw women and people of color in our cartoons now.
We so appreciate that.
Let's just keep it amongst ourselves. Okay. But, at the last convention I was at, I was approached by somebody saying, "Keith, you should submit to the New Yorker." And I said, "How come?" She says, "I think they're actively they're actively seeking women and people of color to contribute." Yeah. So,
gay people as well.
I got the secret email. So.
Oh, you did?
If anybody wants it.
I can actually tell you what it is, but okay.
It's a lot of spec work, though.
What?
It's a lot of spec work.
Yeah.
It is
a lot of spec work.
It is a lot of spec work, but
we're not here to talk about me, though.
No, but you know, that's the great thing about being a cartoonist is you come up with all these cartoons, and just because they don't run in the New Yorker doesn't mean you can't use them.
Yeah, it does.
No, well, one of my favorite exhibits that I'd ever seen were the rejected New Yorker cartoons at the Cartoon Art Museum in San Francisco. And there was stuff in there that was so funny. And I could see it being inappropriate for the New Yorker, but it was hilarious, like the stuff that was in there. It was so funny. And nowadays, with self-publishing and you're having your own websites and all this different stuff, like even if you do the whatever, 10 a week that get rejected and all that type of stuff, that's 10 that you can put in your next book, you know, as long as they're not total crap.
It's a lot of pain, Keith. It's a lot of pain.
But it is, but we're used to rejection.
Yeah,
we're used to it, so it's okay. It's okay.
All right, Signe, so I'm going to move on to your two, and did you say?
Well, I have two. He asked us to do them on the gun issue, and I live in Philadelphia, and we have always been in competition with Baltimore to see how many more people we can kill than Baltimore, and we were ahead until this last year. I'm so proud to say. But so I was looking over my cartoons on guns, on how, what I would choose, and I was sort of roughly counting them up, and just since the year 2000, I've done approximately 160 cartoons on guns. I hate it when there's another shooting, because it's like, I think I've already done all I can possibly say on this thing, and yet it still shocks everybody again that one happens. So I'm going to show one, and I'm going to show them to show you how pointless cartooning really is in the scheme of things. One is a cartoon I did after a particular round of shootings in Philadelphia, and it's like it's the kind of cartoon I've done. Of the 160, probably 70 are kind of like this one.
Want to put it up?
Yep. My opinion, the city's lead abatement program still needs work. And it's mostly kids. It's not mostly kids. It's mostly poor people in the poorest part of the city who are getting killed, and it's mostly African Americans. And as a cartoonist, a white cartoonist, race is a super touchy issue. But if I didn't draw the characters black, it wouldn't be the reality of what we're experiencing in the city. But I got tired of drawing these cartoons, and people go, "Oh yes, that's really nice. Can we use it in our newsletter or church bulletin or whatnot?" And then 2 days later, there'd be another bunch of killings, and it seemed like sort of pointless. And I felt like people were really talking around the issue. Now, this is many years before Black Lives Matter, so this is going to be super, even worse for all of you to see. But it was one of the most controversial cartoons I did. if you want great views of young black men killing each other, and it's the Ku Klux Klan travel, come to Philadelphia. You're not laughing. Well, a lot of people did not laugh, and a lot of particularly African-American activists really went after me in a fairly major and direct way. We were inundated with letters and calls and pickets and whatnot. And I show this because then what happens when you draw a really controversial cartoon that gets at something pretty fundamental that a lot of people are thinking about but don't have a way of discussing, is that we put all those letters in the newspaper. We wrote about, we gave op-eds to people who objected to it. And then after they were in the paper, then we got the second wave, which is, wait a minute, that's what's happening in our city. She's right, even though she's a weird white woman. That's okay. That this is what was happening in the city, and then the discussion takes on a life of its own. Has nothing to do with the cartoon. The letter writers kept going back and forth among themselves. This is pre-internet chat room, there, a real discussion. It became a discussion in the city about, what we ought to be doing about violence. And I ended up some months later on a panel, and the guy who sat down next to me was one of my big accusers. But we were on a panel on something different that we both agreed on. And we got talking about it. He said, well, my opinion has really actually changed after the whole discussion that we went through. And again, even having gone through all that, it became more of an issue. The mayor, our Mayor Nutter, in his inauguration address, talked about gun violence in the African American community as one of the real issues that he wanted to deal with. But still, we have about 250 murders so far this year. So, cartoons, while they can draw people's attention to things, they, in and of themselves, can't, unfortunately, solve anything.
Well, just I also have one of mine on this issue. This one, for me, happened right after the Newtown shootings, and I was in my studio kind of squeezing my brain all day trying to think, what can I do about something so painful? How can I make a joke? But I felt the need to say something, and finally I gave up, and I turned on the radio, and John Hockenberry on The Takeaway was interviewing some gun owners in the Midwest. And one of them said the exact words in this caption, and the image just popped into my head fully formed. People not from here don't understand. It's not a weapon, it's a way of life. So next I'm going to show a few cartoons. And what I was wondering about is, in my memory, I don't ever remember the country being quite as divided as it is now on every level, and how, fraught the discourse is. And so I'm going to show, a few of your cartoons in a row, and then we're going to maybe we'll talk a little about how that affects your work. First one is by Tom, and it's just a really interesting cartoon.
Do you want me to say anything about it, or just? Do you want me to?
You want to say a couple of words about it? That'd be great.
Well, again, this is it's simple and complicated at the same time. I mean, you can see it's sometimes you read a situation, the purchase of the National Geographic, and you start thinking about it, and sometimes the imagery just all aligns and falls right into place, and this is one of them, and I don't really need to add much to it.
I'm going to show, this is Keith, one of Keith's.
So I actually do, talking about gun issues, I've been doing police brutality cartoons for 20 plus years. And last year, as I was doing one about Ferguson, I was like, I can't, every time I do this, I feel like, you know, is this the last one that I have to do? Like, I'd be so psyched if that was the case, but it never is the case. And so I put together all my my cartoons into a slideshow, and started touring the slideshow. So now I present 20 years of my police brutality cartoons and try to talk about I kind of sort of the modern era of police brutality, starting in '92 with Rodney King, and up until now. And I'm constantly adding to it. But this is one of the most interesting pieces that came, you know, towards. That's at the end of the slideshow. And the great thing about social media is someone always says the right thing about this stuff. So when I talk about All Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement, someone put it on Twitter, and I'll always remember this. When I have a bumper sticker that says "Save the Rainforest," it doesn't mean F all the other forests. It means the rainforests are getting cut down at an exorbitant rate, and we should do something about it. So, yeah, so that's what we mean by Black Lives Matter. It doesn't mean nobody else's lives matter. It means stuff is happening in a very bad way, and something needs to be done about it. And anybody who sits there and gets bent out of shape because it says Black Lives Matter, you honestly got to think about what's making you bent out of shape. A strip that I did super recently, I just moved to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and I've always been hesitant to write about the South because I never lived there. But now that I'm in the South, I can write about it now. And my local newspaper had this guy write into the op-ed, and he was very angry white man, writing in saying that the black community is making white people feel guilty because of all this police brutality stuff on black people. And so I did this comic saying, it's not the black community that's making you feel guilty, sir. It's your eyes, it's your heart, and it's your brain. And it's telling you, as you're seeing all this stuff happening, your brain and your eyes and your heart is telling you to feel bad because it's bullshit what's going on. And so you're just being human. It's a human reaction to feel bad when you see this. And the question is, what do you do with those bad feelings? Do you fight for justice, or do you write a silly op-ed to your local newspaper? So that was.
You mentioned social media. I'm wondering, do you obsessively follow comments? You're all moved from print to digital in a lot of ways. Do you guys search for the reactions to your work when it appears? Does that bother you, or?
You'll learn early on that you're going to get clobbered.
Yeah.
I mean, just clobbered. And it's gotten worse, but luckily by the time it had gotten worse, the skin had gotten already pretty thick. Mm-hmm. I look at them just to educate myself as to the range of opinion, the intensity of opinion. You cannot take it personally, and you have to understand that you have to picture this person sitting at his keyboard trying to think of the words that he can find that will hurt you the most. So you can feel the sweat beating on the forehead. What can I say? But I've heard it all now. I mean, it's, you know.
Have any of you guys regretted something you've published afterwards, thinking maybe you'd gone too far, or?
The regret is when some examples have been when the cartoon is read opposite of its intent. Mm-hmm. And it makes you question your delivery. Sometimes somebody will, on purpose, misread it they know what you're at, what you're about, but they will say there's enough information here that it's ambiguous, so I'm going to say that you were doing it back, or you were going to say the other thing. Those just are communications criticisms which make you question just exactly the method of presentation. Generally speaking, I don't think, you spend enough time thinking about what you're going to say and why you want to say that somebody being upset about it isn't going to make you want to change your mind. But sometimes misinterpretation does give you a moment of a pause, yeah.
I think timing also, the New Yorker closes on Friday and comes out on Monday, and in an issue that closed, I did a joke about a beheading. And then over the weekend, there was a beheading, and on Monday the magazine was inundated with outraged people, none of whom could understand that there was nothing that could be done about it, it had nothing to do with it. But I sure wish I hadn't published that cartoon. So.
One of the things about the New Yorker cartoons, I'd be interested in your comment, is maybe in the last 10 years, guns appear as joke items in the cartoons, images.
I'm prepared for this because I thought about it when you mentioned it to me.
I would just like to say, I have never found one of them funny.
Well,
because it feels so heavy.
Let me ask you this, not to be defensive, but do you when you watch TV and you see CSI or whatever, there's guns in the movies, there's guns on television. What is it about cartoons that make that an issue for you?
I don't know. It's just visceral.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But
I'm going to just show one of mine. And then I'm going to ask Jen to take us through another one of hers.
Okay, this one is called Advice Conservatives Never Give Themselves. You need to cut out the victim mentality. Obama ruined my life. Save the whites. Stop the war on religion. Men's rights now. You should be more respectful of authority. You people are too angry. Lighten up. When are you going to stop living in the past? Get over it. And I did this right after the Sandra Bland incident, the woman who was stopped by police in Texas and died in her jail cell just a couple days later. And, there was just so much reaction, coming from people saying, oh, well, she shouldn't have sassed that cop. And if you compare that to Cliven Bundy, the right-wing response to the rancher, who was grazing his cattle on federal lands and he had an armed standoff, and a lot of people thought he was a hero for standing up to authority, and so there seems to be a bit of a double standard there. And this was also around the time of when the Confederate flag was being hotly debated. So that was the impetus behind this cartoon.
Well, we're going to move to questions for the audience in 1 second. I want to show one more cartoon. It's not by any of us, and it's by someone who is very published everywhere. And you might notice that there are no conservatives on this panel. And I just wonder what your reaction is. Do you think this cartoon is funny? It's by Glenn McCoy. I don't think anybody here is finding it particularly funny. So what does that say about the issue of maybe preaching to the choir, that your work is always directed towards people of the, liberal persuasion? And is that something that you think about at all?
Well, first of all, I would say that Fox News and Rush Limbaugh, they don't really worry about preaching to the choir very much. So I don't really worry about it.
Okay.
And secondly, I think one philosophy of cartooning that I try to follow is do no harm, just like a doctor. And I feel like it's my responsibility to enlighten and to not add to the suffering and misrepresentation in the world. So I would say that this cartoon fails on those counts.
I couldn't agree more. And just one more quick question. You guys been watching the debates?
Mm-hmm. It's funny. I sort of missed the last two, even though I wanted to see them, but I forgot they were on, which goes to show you how boring they've become. I just liked it when they were just crazy, like just saying crazy stuff.
I only asked that because I don't want to leave this as the last image up there, so I'm going to put one of mine up. And this one came to me. This is the point when I thought of this cartoon, then I stopped watching the debates. On the other hand, we could join forces and attack the media. All right, I'm going to take questions from the audience. The microphones are on either side, so anybody have any questions? Go to the microphones. Why don't you go to the microphone to ask your question?
I can't just shout?
No. Apparently not. Because it's on YouTube and C-SPAN. Okay. Oh, we used some bad language.
Sorry, thanks. I was hoping you could just take your last question and take it on a little bit more seriously, because the absence of a conservative on the panel is not a problem, but the absence of conservative viewpoints in good political cartooning, particularly in America, it seems to me, is very noticeable. I'd love to hear a serious consideration of why is that? Is it, I take your point that Fox and Limbaugh don't apologize, but I'd like to know why in political cartooning, as important as it is, where are they?
There are a lot of really very good conservative cartoonists, including Glenn McCoy, whose image David showed. And I think he chose it because it was one of Glenn's not so great cartoons. So he just wanted to show how bad conservatives are. But and if you look at people, always will come at me and say, well, you know, there aren't any cartoonists, and they never give prizes to the cartoonists, to the conservative cartoonists. But the Pulitzer Prize has gone to, in the last 10 or 15 years, to several very conservative cartoonists. So it's just, they don't appear perhaps in the Washington Post. I don't know. You guys have a deficit situation, but they are out there, and they do their work just like we do ours.
I remember someone writing to me saying, if you did conservative cartoons, you would make so much money.
I didn't know that. Oh. Yes.
Hi. I'm a librarian, so I have kind of a dorky librarian question, which is, how do you all, I'm thinking especially the three of you who aren't, Tom, I know you're at the Post, so I'm guessing there's some storage and preservation and archival stuff happening there with your work, but I'm just curious how you keep track of your stuff and organize your stuff, like when you were asked to, you know, give David a cartoon about guns, like, do you tag them? Like, how did you find the ones about guns? Or you just know? So anyone who wants to answer, that'd be great.
Nobody's interested in that question. I can guarantee. But
I'm sorry, nobody else is standing up to ask questions, so I'm here.
Okay, fair enough. No, mine just go into boxes. The archival sophistication that you imagine at the Washington Post, if it exists, they haven't told me about it. I feel bad about this situation because they're one match strike away from oblivion, and but at least I haven't, like, they're not water damaged yet.
I actually think that's a really interesting question because I've never been asked it before. And I would say I tag my blog posts on my own website with different tags for each cartoon, and I do a search on my own website if someone asks me for a cartoon about guns. That's the only way I can remember, really.
But if they sit on your, you know, when they sit on your hard drive and they're certain titles and everything, and
Well,
it's
that
pretty
can be
easy to
helpful.
remember. My originals are splayed across like boxes. Again, I just moved, but it's a mess. Like, it's all over the place. But I do have a few pieces in the Library of Congress, so those will forever be protected. So at least 3 or 4 of them. So there you go.
Martha Kennedy.
Yes, do you have a question over there?
That's Martha Kennedy.
Could you talk about striking a balance between an ambiguity that provokes and having a crystal clear message? How much do you want, how oblique do you want to be? What do you want readers to have to figure out for themselves, and what do you want to tell them directly?
That's a great question for which there is not a good answer. But it's exactly what everybody on the stage deals with every single day, is how to find that balance point between obvious and clever, because the humor in a cartoon is right there. That's where it is where it's not so obvious that it's, hit them over the head, but it's not so obscure that you only people scratching their heads. And it's just a matter of feel. That's what it is. It's like doing this and trying to divine where that point is. And you're always missing with some people, because not every reader is in the exact same place. So some readers are going to find it a little too obvious. Some are going to find it a little too puzzling. And I bet nobody's going to argue with me about that. Or maybe there are. Maybe yes, no.
Well, there's an interesting, since I do different ones, I do a daily comic strip called The Nightlife in the Washington Post on Sundays. But as a daily cartoonist, the one thing when I started it was, like, it's similar to the fact that there's fictional characters mixing in with real stuff a la Doonesbury. But the one thing I took from Doonesbury was, it's hard to look at stuff from the 80s or 90s, because it's very about that time. So when I went ahead to do the dailies, I make references to stuff in obscure ways. So I'm talking about the president like now, but I very rarely name the president. So so that will always stay fresh, because hopefully there'll always be a president, And so I try not to get too specific, or when I make reference to certain things, it's always, there's never anything specific, because someone will open it and go, oh, this is from 20 years ago, like blah, blah, blah. So I try to be as sort of obscure with the daily. But you can't do that a lot with a lot of editorial cartoons, because there's certain things that sometimes you gotta drop. That's why I self-publish most of my books, and the ones that have the shortest shelf life are the editorial cartoons. So I print the fewest of those.
I think what Tom said is also, I think that striking that balance is how you get into people's heads with your work. If you hit them too hard over the head, it doesn't have the same impact as a kind of, the subtlety can get people to think almost like they came up with the idea themselves in a way, which I think is a crucial way to communicate.
I would say the temptation to be didactic, to just be an op-ed columnist, is very strong. Yeah. It would be so nice sometimes to just be able to say what you mean. But that's the game, is that you have to make it a little more complicated. You have to bring a concept into the fold. And so, so that is the challenge of cartooning, basically. It's an extra step.
Yeah.
The other thing, a cartoon depends on a lot of people knowing exactly what you're talking about and have the same information that you do. So if you saw a lot of my cartoons on Philadelphia, you'd have really no idea what they were about if you didn't happen to live there. But also, the difficulty now is that people get their news in so many different places. It's really hard to say what everybody knows, because a lot of people just don't read the same way that they used to in the good old days when I was growing up.
All right, sir, yes?
Yes, hi. I was wondering how much work goes into a cartoon from the idea, you have, this would be, I saw the debate last night, I want to draw a cartoon about it, and kind of like doing the sketching, playing around with the caption, and how long does it take to get to the aha moment, this is what the cartoon is going to be?
David was saying that he heard that line and the image popped right into his head. For me, often it's reading, and reading good, vivid writing is really helpful, because that phrase, you just come across a phrase and the image is right there, and those are the great days when it comes up like that.
There must be some days, though, when you guys really, you decide you want to make a cartoon about something, and you have to sit there and really figure it out.
How can I make it as complicated as a Tom Toles cartoon? That takes me all the way into the afternoon.
Yeah, it comes all different ways. Sometimes it can be a sketch. Sometimes you could hear something. Sometimes you just, it's just all different ways. I think the toughest part is to kind of train yourself to be open all the time, constantly open all the time, and taking in information, and just sort of having a sketchbook there, or having, typing in information so you just remember it. If you put it down on paper, it makes room in your head for more stuff to come in. And
one other thing is, if you feel really clearly about the subject, it's often easier to do a cartoon. And I really admire cartoonists who have that, it's like a direct pipeline to their viewpoint, and they make it clear. And okay, now I'm going to have to give Tom a compliment, but when they were proposing the Iraq War, Tom is drawing in the vortex of the discussion, and he was one of the really consistent voices saying the Iraq War is going to be a nightmare, don't do it. And nobody listened to him. Again, back to my point about cartooning, could have saved the world.
Okay, yeah?
I was, something kind of stood out to me in the opening when the description about the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and that they were a response to a religious figure without naming the religious figure. And so I just wondered if there's anything that's off limits when you are drawing cartoons, or how do you kind of edit your work given certain sensitivities of your readers?
That's another great question. Not to say that all the questions have been perfect in every way.
Mine as well, right?
But this one is actually, there's lively debate, and sometimes very heated debate amongst cartoonists on this very subject. There are, I'd say the spectrum runs from First Amendment purists, which is the obvious and easiest, most facile and shallow. No, I mean, it's the place a cartoonist ought to start. Any journalist ought to start with, okay, my natural ground zero is First Amendment, absolutely. And in a way, I'm there, but as a functioning cartoonist, I am not there. I feel like I ought to have, and do have, and would claim to have the right to say any damn thing I want to. But for me, it's what do I want to say? And there are things that I do not want to say, and if I see another cartoonist saying them, I'm often extremely conflicted in my support for their right to say it and my vigorous disagreement with the judgment that was shown in their saying it, and then I'm left in a bad position, which we got into, all of us, with the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, was, do you have is it desirable for you to, in some way, reprint or support the reprinting of an image that you personally thought was very ill-advised for a variety of reasons. And I found myself in a real quagmire of trying to explain the subtleties of my position on that. But those cartoons in particular, you say, okay, well, if you support free speech, you have to support those cartoons, and you have to support the reprinting of those cartoons. And my answer to that is this. The history of political cartooning contains many, many very shameful chapters. And no, I don't support, with a broad brush, every single thing that has transpired under the rubric of political cartooning. Just the two obvious examples is there have been viciously anti-Semitic cartoons drawn that had real consequences, some extravagantly racist cartoons that had real consequences, bad consequences for real people in the real world. And I can't just say, oh, anything goes, and I support anything that any cartoonist does. I support the right to do it, but honest to God, I mean, there are things that I wouldn't do, and I'm upset when some cartoonists have done things that I think were showing very bad judgment.
I think you state the dilemma we all struggle with really, really well.
The thing is, there are two separate moral questions here. There's the question of free speech, which is actually it was very simple and straightforward. Obviously, we should all be free to express an opinion, no matter how vile, without repercussion, such as without being killed, without being persecuted by the government. There's also the question of representation, which is an important moral question, and it does have real-world consequences as well. And so I think a lot of people are getting confused on this issue because they're mixing these two separate moral questions up, and they're saying you can't have one without the other, or we only have to view things exclusively through the lens of free speech advocacy. I don't think the two are necessarily mutually exclusive. We can completely support the freedom of cartoonists to draw whatever they want. At the same time, we can have a conversation about representation, what those cartoons mean, because that's a part of free speech too.
Okay, we have time for two more questions. Which side? I think I'll go to that side and then you, sir. Yeah.
Thank you. In a society now where we communicate more with texts and tweets and emojis, and where people have a much, I guess, lower attention span now, how do you think political cartoonists, how have political cartoons changed as in ways of informing, the public, where people just don't have the attention span to read, a 5,000-word expose in the New York Times, for example?
Well, social media is the best thing that ever happened to cartoons, and it's the worst thing that's ever happened to cartoons. Our stuff is being seen by more people than ever, and we're getting paid less for it than ever. So it's sort of a combination of the two, where it's like, yeah, it's great. Like I'm getting emails from people all over the world saying, oh yeah, I saw your strip and blah 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 and all this stuff. But what's nice is we're starting to kind of catch up in the sense that there are so many more ways now for cartoonists to make up the lost revenue from all the print media that's gone away. So, I lost like probably 75% of my newspapers and stuff like that. But I've made it up through art patron websites like Patreon. And I make it up through selling prints and coming and I do a lot of shows where I go to schools and present my police brutality slideshow. So those type of things are totally enhanced by social media. So it's again, the greatest thing that ever happened and the worst thing that ever happened at the same time.
I would say back to like the community and people knowing about something. the newspapers traditionally were, or editorial cartoons were traditionally newspaper-based, and people just are not reading newspapers the way they used to. I mean, look at this audience. Most of the people here who know and like cartoons are of a certain age where you still might even think about subscribing to a newspaper, where my children would not, and they know that's how they got through college, so they wouldn't even buy my newspaper. So, at any rate, the downside of it, yes, you get your stuff out to a lot of different places, but it goes to places where people already agree with you, or they like that subject. Whereas a broad-based newspaper got to people who did and didn't like your point of view. And again, how do we get a conversation started? How do we go back and forth on issues if people are in their silos and not, not even seeing the same material? So I think, yes, we get out a lot, but we get out in a much narrower bandwidth a lot of times, and I think that that's not a great thing.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
I just crossed out all my stuff because you covered most of it. So, where do you get your ideas?
I get mine on eBay. I don't know where the rest of them do.
I don't think there's been a line in answer to that hasn't been already said. So,
well, but to a certain extent, just to touch on one last little point. The speculative nature of cartoons, Keith, you mentioned it, and all of you touched on it. Do you think that's driving the content that is being created now more or less? And how do you think that's affecting new cartoonists coming into the field?
What do you mean by the speculative nature?
Well, if I draw a cartoon and I'm not syndicated, I have to try and sell it to somebody, especially if it's a political cartoon, it's got a very short shelf life. So am I going to try and build an audience by drawing things that I think people want to see so that I can get my voice heard? Or do you think, and this, I'm thinking of the young cartoonists out there today trying to find a voice. Is their audience going to find them through the internet and eventually they will find funding? Or is this something that the marketplace is now moving in this direction, so people are going to start drawing cartoons that they think they can sell?
I'll just say, I don't think cartoonists think that way. I think cartoonists think about being artists and creating what the voice inside them tells them to make. And I don't know about everyone else, but I don't think too much about my audience. I think that's a dangerous way to go in terms of developing your own voice.
I think it would be very hard to get started today. I started in the late 90s when alternative newspapers were a growing industry, and it seemed like there was some real potential there. And so I started doing an alt-weekly strip, and very, very slowly managed to get it in enough papers to support myself along with freelance work on the side. And, the Great Recession was very scary. Fortunately, there are some websites that have begun paying for cartoons, like Daily Kos and Truth Out and Alternate, and so they've kind of stepped into the void. But that path that path that seemed, well, it never really seemed all that clear, but it seemed like there was a path at least in the late 90s. Now I don't know what I would say except to be very highly diversified. Like, in addition to doing my weekly strip, I also edit a comics section for the website fusion.net. And I do freelance work. I've done graphic journalism work. It really is about being, it sounds like a cliche, but it's about being extremely entrepreneurial and having lots of balls in the air, basically.
Yeah, very, very similar with me too. I think we started around the same time, and it really is about diversifying. But I actually have more hope for anybody starting out now. I think as long as you're doing a strip that you'd like to see, that you want to read, there were 7, yeah, how many people now? 7 billion?
A lot.
Yeah, there are a lot of people in this world. And all you need to do is find the 1,000. You have 1,000 fans. Everybody here has 1,000 hardcore fans. And you just have to create what, create your work, and you will find those 1,000 fans. And you just have to convince those 1,000 fans to give you $75 a year. And you do that by providing them an opportunity to give you money, by creating books or having a site for them to support, or just different ways and different things. In addition to those 1,000, there's going to be peripheral folks who buy a book every once in a while or support you every once in a while. You just have to continually sort of, it really is a hustle, a constant hustle. And I've never had a steady, I've never had a salaried gig. Yet I've been in the industry for 20 years and have, I'm raising 2 kids on this wacky cartooning thing that my dad's like, where are you making money? But it's there, and when people see that you're doing something that you're passionate about and that they see some sort of truth or sincerity in it, they are willing to support you. And so I say you go for it. One great example is there's a young lady who all she does is review sex toys with her husband, and she has gained this crazy following of people and she makes tons of money for her strip, and she gets free sex toys in the mail and uses them and makes comics out of them. And I mean, seriously, that's it's amazing.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Seriously?
I will show you.
No, I believe it.
Oh, Joy sex toy, right?
Yeah, Oh Joy sex toy. Yeah.
Well, on that note,
Joy
folks, I think we've reached the end of the program. Thank you all.
All right, so we. Do you see why?